Welcome, I'm Nick Callanan. This is another edition of the Maine Outdoor Film Festival's Filmmaker in Focus. Today we have with us Patrick Bonsant, the director and filmmaker of the Stackpole Bridge, Story in the Stone, a wonderful documentary about a almost 160-year-old bridge, actually more than that, in Saco, called the Stackpole Bridge, and he documents the effort to save this bridge and how the town of Saco and its townspeople worked to all compromise and make this happen. And we're going to be showing this film September 29th at Talbot Auditorium on the Portland campus of USM at 10:30 in the morning. And Patrick will be there. But Patrick, thanks so much for being here.
It's my pleasure.
So how did you get interested in creating this story? What spoke to you about making this film?
Well, I think it was 2013 when a couple of women in a neighborhood group called the Friends of the Stackpole Bridge reached out to me. They'd seen an earlier film I'd made about conservation in Hollis. It was called Saco River Indian Cellar, about a local grassroots group that saved a portion of the Saco River shoreline from being carved into 12 house lots. So they knew that I had an interest in conservation issues and preservation. So they reached out to me, and they only wanted a small piece they could present to the decision makers in Saco at City Hall. So I showed up with my camera, and they shared a lapel mic, and they laid out the issue. And I remember thinking, oh, these are well-intentioned ladies, but I have seen many projects of a historic preservation nature go down in flames. I was a volunteer up at the St. Lawrence Arts Center, and that was heartbreaking to see that fall. And in Buxton, there was little or no sentiment. Buxton is where I work. Little or no sentiment for preservation. They took down a 100-year-old school there. So I thought, well, I will help them out. I'll do a piece, and I thought that would be the end of it. Best of luck to you ladies, but you have an uphill battle on your hands. And they did. Before we met, they had already been in the fight for 4 or 5 years. And so as the vote came down in 2015, they reached out to us again. They had a bagpiper that was standing in a snowbank by the bridge, and they asked us to make a one last pitch to save this bridge. And somehow the film details all of the steps in the process, or most of them, but somehow they were able to prevail.
Yeah, and that, so our office is in Union Station, in Portland here, and of course, it's the office building that remains, but it's next to the site of the former Union Station that, was torn down in the 60s, and apparently that was the beginning of the sort of National Historic Landmark movement, or that was one of the very important architectural losses that spawned that movement. So, I'm also fully aware of, the failures of that, and, and your film details, a wonderful success. And I like the way that it does become a compromise. And the solution is a bit of a compromise in more ways than one, frankly. And, and I think that's very inspiring as we talk about, land management and, building and resource management, and in the context of development and this sort of thing, that, 2 sides, 3 sides. I mean, this is a complex issue that you've detailed in your film, can come together for something that works. And you do have a lot of experience in these other projects. But what is this particular one in that solution? Does that give you any hope, moving forward, or?
Well, yes and no. It really depends on the energy and the commitment of people who come together and fight for these causes. I'm not aware of what might have been going on as far as a debate back in the 60s when they tore down Union Station, but we're all living with the outcome. and frankly, it sucks. That strip mall is horrible.
I mean, main hardware is great.
Yeah.
You know, Buck Dance is
Oh,
great.
sure,
Don't get me wrong,
sure.
but they could have been in.
Yeah, with no aspersions cast on the businesses there.
Of course.
That strip mall leaves a lot to be desired when you look at the magnificent structure that was once there. And if this Stackpole project had not had a committed leader like Inga Brown, I would call her the heroine of my documentary. She'd probably cringe to hear me say that, but she showed up at meetings for at least 8 to 10 years, and she was articulate, she was respectful, she was uncompromising, and in the end, I really think that she was pivotal in saving that bridge.
And how do you feel about the fact that you know, they did have to sort of, you know, I mean, I guess it's a spoiler alert, and we can just have this conversation and decide later whether we're going to want to include this in the final edit of this episode. But you know, but I'm interested in you know, your take as somebody who's actually been part of the project for, you know, more than 5 or 6 years. You know, you were what year was it when you first?
2013.
So yeah, so you know, you've been a part of this for 5 years plus, and so, but how do you feel about the way that they had to sort of like, you know, build it with modern materials from the inside and then sort of have that facade on it? Do you think that essence is maintained? What's your take on?
I do think the essence is maintained. Yes, it is just the facade right now, and it does have modern structure within, but what were the alternatives? You know, a culvert pipe? You know, or some crappy concrete kind of like bridge? I mean, I have seen what goes up in place of old bridges. They're boring. So I'm sympathetic to those who wanted it to be part of the National Historic Register. But when they got in there, the reality was this 165-year-old bridge that was built by farmers in 1847 or 1848 had deteriorated. It's actually semi-miraculous that it's still there at all, given the forces and pressures of floods and what have you that took place over the century and a half that it was there.
And not to mention attempted repairs.
Right.
By, you know, using modern technology.
Botched repairs.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I think the other thing is too, it's like, you know, and this is one of the compromises that I was talking about, which, you know, it made it more complex, but they did not decide to do that until they got in there, you know, and it was like, well, we've got to see what we have, you know, and then having the data that they had, then they made the next best decision, you know, so, you know, yeah, maybe it would have come into just about the same money and maybe probably a little bit more if they'd like just ripped it out and started over, you know, but I mean, I forget one of the historians in your film talked about the importance of maintaining it to have a visual and physical representation of the skills of those farmers, of the time that they lived in, and I think that's huge. And you can still see that in the bridge despite its, you know, new core.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's awesome.
And that brings up a point. There are no heavy-handed political points in the film, but it does bring home the point that immigrants bring actual skills to America. Those folks were likely given their names on the warrant that was signed at Saco City Hall in the mid-19th century, were likely Scottish or Irish, and they brought over those skills here. And that's something we should be welcoming today as well.
Yeah, true. That, I mean, as a person of Irish descent, I'm glad we did then.
Yeah.
And we should now.
And it is, I don't, from what you've told me, you're a journalist, and part of this process has been an investigation. It's almost like detective work, because very little attention was paid to this bridge for whatever reason. I've been to the Maine Historical Society, I've been to the Portland Room, I've been to the Dyer Library. There's very little information about it, and very few pictures. So that was a challenge as far as making the film goes.
Yeah, and I did want to get to that as well in terms of what was your sort of first thread beyond Inga, to like do that background research? Like how did you source the was it all primary documents, or how did you begin to source your subjects and the information that you used in the film?
First, I went to the Dyer Library, the history room there, and they did have the old warrant that the farmers signed back then. And those farmers, as is indicated in the film, lived in that particular neighborhood of Saco. But there was a much larger history beyond a bunch of farmers coming together to make a bridge. So I was at the Green Hand bookstore here in Portland, and I was talking to Michelle and asked her if she knew of an art history professor that might give us even more background, really delve into it a little bit, to a point anyway. And so that's where Virginia Rose came into play. And we're going back thousands of years at that point. I wanted to add that context.
Yeah, and I'm glad you did. I mean, it makes it so thorough. Patrick, how did you get interested in this type of subject, this type of storytelling, historical?
Well, I'm kind of an accidental historian. My first film out in the Hollis area where I work was a documentary about the town of Buxton. It took me 3 years to film it. It was funded by a grant from the Narragansett No. 1 Foundation, which was started by a family that won Powerball. So they are interested in promoting Buxton-specific projects. And I think that too was part of what drew the folks from Friends of the Stackpole Bridge to us, because they had seen that film, and there was so much overlap between rural Saco and Buxton, so much so that there really was no difference back then. So that one led to a grant from the Davis Conservation Foundation to make the Saco River Indian Cellar film. And when I was younger, I really didn't pay much attention to history. It was just something I was always living in the present. And but now I'm fascinated by it, particularly that area of Maine, the mill culture, which is what I come from, and farming, which I also come from on the Irish side. So it was just interesting to me to explore my roots in that regard.
Yeah, that's awesome. So what's next? What do you have on tap? Is there anything you can talk about, some future projects with us?
Well, I don't have anything in the pipeline right now, but I have an open and curious mind, and my job, I'm very fortunate to have the job I have as the director of Saco River Community TV, because I'm always meeting people, and they're always bringing ideas to the table. Someone has mentioned a History of Hollis documentary, but as you know, documentaries don't pop out of toasters. They require funding. So I'm waiting and anticipating that next bolt of inspiration.
Well, that's certainly on its way. What about for this film? Where will people be able to, obviously we're going to be screening it on September 29th at USM's Talbot Auditorium at 10:30. Patrick will be there. So that's one spot, but do you have plans for distribution beyond that or anything? Is there, that you're comfortable talking about?
At this time, we have modest distribution plans. The film is all about education as far as I'm concerned. We don't have any profit motive necessarily. We just want to let people know about a slice of Saco history that they might not have considered. I mean, the film kind of touches on the fact that there's sort of an urban-rural divide as far as the focus and interest on history, on local history. So I think we've done a pretty good job of opening up people to what goes on in the countryside and the role they played in supplying food to people who worked in the mills and factories back then, among other places. So
yeah, and the bridge was a huge part of that.
Yeah, and the film will be in local libraries.
Cool.
The Dyer Library in Saco, of course. We have a showing down there on the 27th of September.
Nice.
and the MacArthur Library in Biddeford, the Portland Public Library. And beyond that, I'm going to make 25 to 50 copies of it, possibly send it in to Maine Public Broadcasting's community films to see if they might have any interest.
Cool. And will it be on Saco River Community Television?
Well, we want to get it out there and show it in public venues first,
Cool.
but eventually, most likely, yes.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Is there anything that I should have asked you about that I didn't?
Well, I want to mention the contribution that David Blaze, my collaborator, made as far as the drone footage goes. I had held off on getting a drone because they are everywhere now, and but for our film, I think it was a game changer to have those broad images of the town of Saco and the countryside. It really made a big difference. So hats off to him, and he's an audio engineer too, and we both know how difficult audio can be.
Yeah. So he was a huge role.
Yeah, and you can have the best ideas ever, but if you don't have the technical support and know-how, your film's going to flounder.
Well, it's an excellent film. I really hope people can check it out. You get a great taste of the city of Saco and the sort of interpolitical playings in the city in terms of the coast, inland, historically how those two communities work together. You understand this effort that sort of divides the town, not in a into warring factions, but at least it's it's split on the opinion, and it is a really it's awesome. It's an awesome display of democracy in action that this solution came to light, and it's something that everyone can live with, and it's it's a testament to America in a lot of ways, and I really enjoyed it, and I hope people can come and check it out at our showing or at the Dyer Library on the 27th, and at the other places you mentioned as well. Great job, man.
Yeah, we're very proud of the film, and we hope people will show up to check it out.
Yeah, I hope so too, and you should be. And thanks so much for coming in today.
Not a problem at all. It's my pleasure.